Previously in Yugioh CG, Booster 5 was released. This small set featured Konami's push of defensive combat with the likes of Needleworm, Morphing Jar, and Royal Decree. While nothing would be meta-defining due to the card pool and meta climate, it showed that the game was willing to try new ideas out in order to expand playstyles away from basic beatdown, even if that strategy backfired due to the game's own rulings. The standard deck was still very much aggressive and oppressive. Then on November 18th, 1999, Volume 6 was released, which continued to further Yu-Gi-Oh's development. Just like how you can continue your own development by subscribing to the Janjo Zone. The set would mostly be known for its new inclusion of counter traps, or at least what they would eventually be referred to as. This is because, on release, the classification of the counters would be called the same name as all the other existing trap cards, similar to how continuous traps aren't classified as such, just not stating they are destroyed after activation. These would later be identified as their own class since their function is to stop other cards. This gives the back row a new axis of power without creating a third back row card type. And these are powerful, as you have Magic Negation, Trap Negation, Summon Negation, and a catch-all Omni Negate. Magic Jammer and 7 Tools of the Bandit would be pretty solid in a vacuum for what they do. I mean, being able to stop powerful spells and traps was nothing to scoff at, whereas Horn of Heaven is more or less a worse trap hole. Although considering trap hole was limited at the time, this would be an unlimited secondary option if you greatly value the on-summon removal. The last new trap would be the strongest in Solemn Judgment. To stop spells, traps, and summons equals overwhelming versatility, even if it was just normal summons. Any deck can use it, though it does cost half your life points. Heck, the first time I saw the card in the TCG, I thought it was a dud. Apparently, OCG duelists at the time thought so too, or at least relative to the meta. Back then, duelists put higher value on their life points, as well as placing more stock in cards that affect more in battling over hindering your opponent otherwise. Losing half of your life points is incredibly risky in a format where aggressive pushes are the norm, so Solemn Judgment would work better in the side deck at best, which is surprising considering how powerful this card is to stop just about anything, especially at this point when most cards had a single function. Though as time went on, the card would get reevaluated and as such, adopted in higher frequencies. The other major inclusion in Volume 6 has to be the 2 searchers, Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. Each corresponds to an attack and defense stat, and when they're sent to the grave, you can add a monster that meets that stat criteria from your deck to your hand. So Sangan could search more defensive monsters like Giant Soldier of Stone, and Witch could search stronger monsters like Summon Skull. Plus, at this point in the game, the card text was that they get their effects regardless of how they're sent, meaning a card like Graceful Charity could dump one and still get their effect off. So now Graceful could essentially be viewed as a card that doesn't lose you any cards, since you get new cards in return. You could also consider a Tribute to the Doom to have gained value by this method as well. Another benefit to the Searchers, no, not the phenomenal John Wayne movie, is that they don't need to be flipped, and makes your opponent's removal options for it wasteful. And the removal means you can potentially swing tempo in your favor if a Witch turns into a Gemini Elf to help you get over your opponent's threats. Both are incredibly flexible cards that their main disadvantage is that they don't do much pre-destruction. I mean, at least Sangan works with Crush Card Virus. Sangan into Mask of Darkness only means more virus uses in both available monsters and trap uses. Mask Virus is back, baby! And if you're enjoying this video, then consider supporting me via Patreon. These videos take a lot of work, and even the smallest of your donations can help the longevity of the channel. $2 a month goes a long way more than a lot of this YouTube ad revenue, so consider supporting me. Thank you. This leads us to new monsters that can be searched from said searchers. First off is Muka Muka, that increases its attack depending on how many cards you have in hand. So for a weak monster, it can reach 2100 attack with only 5 cards in your hand, which is obviously strong. At this point, there was no hand size limit, meaning Muka could potentially beat over a Blue Eyes. Though, on the contrary, if you have that many cards, that means those are cards sitting in your hand. Alternatively, if you use those cards, then Muka will become naturally weaker. It's a catch-22. Muka is a monster that takes more finesse than the average card. Other notable cards include Cannon Soldier. By tributing one monster on your field, you can inflict 500 damage to your opponent. Wow, an activation effect? This is new. While not at its peak quite yet, the burn damage can stack up, in addition to being able to trigger your searchers on command. We'd also see the Attribute Boosters, a series of monsters that, while on field, increase specific attributes and decrease other specific attributes. Even though they're fragile by themselves, a 500 widespread attack buff is strong. Unfortunately, playing traps like Kunai gave duelists less risk with more rewards, since traps can be used when most convenient, with any monster, and without using a summon. You could compare these to being as specific as Equip Magic, which vanished from the meta long ago. Other odd cards would be Air Eater and Flame Cerberus. Yeah, Cerberus, even though its OCG name is just Flame Cerberus. Unsure why Konami to this day has never fixed it, but I digress. These two cards are notable for being both solid tribute monsters for the budget duelist. While the last set we did see Machine King, it was a booster set, which made these ones in a volume set to be easier to obtain, even if their attack powers are noticeably lower, with both sitting at 2100 attack, whereas Machine King has 2300 post-effect. Volume 6 would continue having some questionable effect monsters like Dragon Piper. This flip destroys Dragon Capture Jars, if only dragons were still meta-relevant. Alongside this was Great Moth, which you could consider the budget version of its perfect version. It is to that as Machine King was to Summon Skull. That said, Ultimate Great Moth was only really used in UO decks, in which Great Moth would not fit in any capacity. There's also Shadow Ghoul, which is pretty bad in most scenarios. At least V6 gave us a polymerization reprint, with alt art no less. This is much needed considering it is necessary to access the fusion deck at all. Alongside the new fusions, Musician King requires Witch as one of its fusion materials. So translated, you have another way to proactively send Witch to the grave and get a special summon out of it, something that was uncommon at the time. You just needed to play Lady of Faith, which was an otherwise useless vanilla. Interestingly enough, you may wonder why its fusion materials are so unfitting. Well, considering the musician is clearly inspired by heavy metal guitarists of the 1970s and 80s, the materials fit that theme when translating. Lady of Faith's OCG name is High Priestess, and Witch's is about the same as her TCG name. And would you look at that, bands called Judas Priest and Angel Witch. Perhaps King's name should have been Guitar and Roses, or Zipper Man. Lastly, let's bring up the singular card, Giltia the D Knight. Again, another weird translation where its OCG name is Giltia the Magical Knight. I'm unsure why the TCG name becomes Giltia the D Knight, because the D supposedly means dark, which is ironic given its light type, something that has been giving it use in later formats. Even weirder is that this new card and the new Thousand Dragon were both normal monsters in the anime. With Flame Swordsman previously released, all these cards were Joey's cards that got turned into vanillas. He really got screwed. Not the first time and not the last time this color change would occur. That's pretty much it in regards to V6's card pool. The push of weak effect monsters were definitely felt, more so in regards to the Searchers, of whom gave the largest buff to one of the scariest decks in Yu-Gi-Oh history, Exodia. While those lucky few who had a complete set of the Forbidden One did try the deck out in the past, having two Searchers, which were at 3, that can search any piece out, greatly accelerated Exodia's win condition. We see this in modern critter format decks, where the constant resource loop to eventually achieve what you need is not a strategy to ignore. But over in the OCG, add 2 more copies of the Searcher in the mix, in addition to using Monster Reborn, and you can see the ease in achieving a checkmate. Suddenly, Standard now has a disadvantage when it comes to attacking. Or if they remain in attack mode, the other duelists can simply crash their Searcher to achieve a search proactively. Remember, with the current card pool, if a Sangan hit the field, unless your opponent did nothing, that monster only had one place to go, the graveyard. It was not a deck you wanted to play the long-term game with either, since Exodia can end games faster than Standard. Don't you forget that Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity, Monster Reborn, and Swords of Revealing Light were all unlimited as well. This is when the deck destruction duo of Booster 5 would become more useful. More so since, if you recall, there is no hand limit, meaning the opponent could hoard pieces. On the bright side, Exodia was still difficult to build given the scarcity of the 5-piece combination. Reminds me of the early TCG when it took me a few years just to see a complete Exodia set. November 18th, 1999 marked an interesting shift in Yu-Gi-Oh! Konami clearly knew that beatdown was becoming an issue and injected the game with effect monsters and trap cards galore. I can't undervalue the strength Exodia received from this set. What's scarier is that due to card availability, Exodia wasn't even at its prime yet. Tokyo Dome or Volume 6, Exodia was surrounded only by controversy, but you could see the writing on the walls should Exodia see a reprint soon, ignoring if any other cards come out that support the strategy. At the very least, duelists were more apprehensive to play such a degenerate, solitaire deck. Safe to say that this was the start of a dark period of the OCG. But what do you all think? Was Volume 6 too much of a jump, or did Yu-Gi-Oh! Need this injection of spice? Let me know in the comments below.